Dr. De Roy, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today to share the findings of this report. Maybe the place to start is just to give you a bit of context about the Social Progress Index itself. I was slightly shocked to realise that next year it'll be the 10th anniversary of when we released our first ever Social Progress Index. This was a project that my organisation, Social Progress Imperative, which is a US non-profit, developed with Professor Michael Porter of Harvard Business School and Professor Scott Stern of MIT. And the idea was to create a comprehensive measure of the performance of societies in non-economic terms, because we really felt there was a need to rebalance the conversation. Economic growth has done a huge amount of benefit for the world, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell us whether that growth is inclusive. It doesn't tell us whether that growth is sustainable. And so we thought that by measuring social progress, creating a social progress index, this is something that could be of practical benefit to decision makers. And that really was our focus. This was never started as an academic exercise. Our eye was always on, could we create something to help people who have to make difficult decisions make better decisions? And that remains the aspiration of this project, just as much as that work we've done elsewhere in the world. And we're delighted that the Social Progress Index is being launched today here in India. Over the last 10 years, we've worked with a number of partners around the world. For more than 5 years, the European Commission has used the Social Progress Index as a tool for regional policy within the European Union, for what they call cohesion policy. They're using the Social Progress Index to shape the development policy of the European Union. Across major cities in the United States, from San Jose in California to Philadelphia on the East Coast, city leaders are using the Social Progress Index as a way of generating equitable and inclusive growth in their cities. And in my home country, in my home city of London, government leaders are using Social Progress Index to make sure that no one is left behind in their communities. So Social Progress Index is a tested practical tool that we really hope is one that's going to bring real benefit to the decision makers of India, to bring real benefit to the people of India. That's the aspiration of this report. This report is there to help create a real impact. And I must say the success of this report must be judged in terms of whether it achieves those aims of being a helpful contribution to supporting the inclusive development of India. So that's a bit of context on who we are, what we do. And so this report in particular brings this now to India, to 32 states and union territories, and also to 707 districts. So we've got a nice degree of granularity there, taking us down to the level of states and districts to really explore the pattern of social progress across India, to generate insight, I think, for government. Obviously, we're delighted the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister is the customer for this report, and this is can be applied across national government, but also state government, district government, but also a tool that can be very relevant for businesses, thinking about how they contribute to society, but also to NGOs and other non-profit actors, thinking about where they should focus and prioritize. So this report has got a lot of richness and depth on which I can only just scratch the surface in this short presentation. Let me introduce the Social Progress Index. The key thing about every Social Progress Index is it's built on this basic framework. And this framework we developed when we developed the first Social Progress Index. We looked at the academic literature, we looked at international agreements, and around this constructed this framework of what makes a good society. And what we said was a good society is one that meets the basic needs of survival of everyone, essentially food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, a good society is one that gives everyone the foundations of well-being: basic education, access to information, health, and a good quality environment. And thirdly, a good society is one that gives everyone opportunity in terms of rights, freedoms, inclusiveness, and access to advanced knowledge. These 3 dimensions and 12 components are the basic building blocks of every social progress index that we build around the world. And this has actually proven very robust across different cultural contexts. So this provides a very sort of robust framework. We started this work before the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, but obviously we knew what was coming. And we would say that there's a very close conceptual mapping between the Social Progress Index and the Sustainable Development Goals. So it means that the Social Progress Index can work as a reasonable approximation of how we're doing against the SDGs as well. So that's the basic framework for the Social Progress Index. The next thing we have to do is find a way of measuring it. And one of the big decisions we made when we designed the Social Progress Index was that there would be no primary data collection. Because if we had to do primary data collection, it would make it unreasonably expensive. The approach we took was actually there's lots of data out there. What we want to do is find a way of organizing and structuring it so it's useful to people. So in that sense, the Social Progress Index isn't a data initiative, it's more like a grammar initiative. We're taking the data that's out there and finding a way of structuring it so it can become meaningful messages for decision makers. That's what we're trying to do. How do we do it? Well, we start off with selecting a set of indicators. So indicators have to have a wide geographical coverage. We can't take one indicator for this region, different indicator for this region. We've got to find indicators that cover evenly across the territory we want to cover. So, for example, across the 707 districts. Secondly, we have to have indicators that are measures of outcomes. One of the big design decisions we made with the Social Progress Index is we wanted it to be as policy neutral as possible. We're measuring outcomes, not inputs. We don't want to measure how much a country or a state spends on education. We want to measure the education outcomes. We don't want to measure whether you pass laws against discrimination. We want to measure whether people experience discrimination. I think that way that takes us away from a whole set of complex policy and political debates and into the concrete story of measuring outcomes. It also means that unlike some other indices, if you can't really game the Social Progress Index. The only way to game the Social Progress Index is to improve the outcomes. And that's what we want in the first place. We obviously want to have data that comes from trusted, high-quality sources. We don't want to take data that's unreliable or where we don't have credibility and trust in it. And indeed, for this work, we've relied exclusively on government indicators. But we'd always look for high-quality indicators. And finally, they've always got to be related to social and environmental issues. So that's what we do. We go out and we say what data is out there that meets these criteria. We also want data that's relatively recent as well, ideally with some time series behind it. And once we've sifted through these possible indicators, then it takes us to the phase of calculating the index. So the calculation, in a sense, starts by capturing these data sets from different places, then pulling them together, and then doing some work on the data to address problems like there may be missing values. So what do you do? How do you statistically impute some of those missing values? We've got data that's measuring very different things. It could be measuring, rates of violence against school achievements, against prevalence of diabetes. So you've got to normalize that data. You've got to take those apples and oranges and cauliflowers and put them onto a consistent basis where they can be measured against each other. This is this data transformation and standardization process. And then thirdly, what you've got to do is make sure the model fits together conceptually in the right way and statistically. So this is addressing things around unidimensionality. So are we sure that the indicators we have for each component of the model are measuring the same underlying concept? You don't want indicators that are actually measuring different concepts. And you have statistical tests for that. You want to test to make sure that indicators aren't redundant or moving in opposite directions. So the set of tests that we go through to then make sure we've got a robust index and we can compute reliable scores. I mean, I always want to stress, any fool can build an index, but building a robust index is hard work and there is a set of practice around that. We're very proud of the fact that Social Progress Imperative has worked with some of the leading experts in this field, particularly the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, the world-leading experts. They've audited our methodologies. They've given us very high marks. We've also, since we started this project, had full transparency about the methodology of how we build social progress indices. And I'm delighted to say that in the report you have today, you will find full transparency on the methodology for this index. And that's so important, that transparency has allowed us to then receive feedback from people, to test and make sure that this is a robust a product as possible. And I want to say very clearly at this stage is we love feedback. Feedback will make this product stronger. We know it's not perfect. I am sure it can be made better. It will be made better by feedback from people like you. We think it's a good, strong product, but it can always be made better, and having that openness to feedback is a critical part of this process. So you'll find all the details of the methodology and the data in the report, and we welcome feedback, and there's contact details for our expert team within the report itself. So that's sort of the prelude. Let me just quickly show you, this is no time to go into this in detail, is the full set of indicators. As Amit said, we finally chose 89 indicators for our state level index. I do not intend to or expect to go through each of these indicators now. Probably too small to read. Just as those are in the report. And again, what we've done is we've selected 89 indicators from all the available data that we think conceptually fits, meets data quality standards, and statistically fits together to make a robust measurement. So that's all the details of that are in the report itself. So, for states, 89 indicators. Let me start first of all by sharing you what we found out at the state level. And I wanted to show you this map of the different states and union territories of India. And what we've done is we've broken this into 6 tiers. Now the tiers of performance are based not on sort of quintiles or whatever a quintile would be if you divide it by 6. I don't even know, sextile or something. What we've done is use an approach we've applied elsewhere in the world, where we look for clusters within the data. So we're looking for within the data a feature of what are the 6 groups we see within the data to break this up into 6 tiers. So I'm going to talk you through the results for the states through these tiers. Starting first of all with the top tier, which is Puducherry. I must say, and if anyone wants to cheer for their state, you're very welcome to at any point or whatever. So Puducherry, congratulations, is the top performing state on the India Social Progress Index, all the way through to Kerala. So these 9 states form a clear group of being at the highest level of social progress, the very high social progress states of India. Our second grouping then takes us through from Jammu and Kashmir at 10 to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at 15. Just looking at this data, what was quite apparent to me is that many of these top performing states are quite small. And indeed, that's a pattern that we tend to see around the world when looking at countries or regions elsewhere. It seems to be easier to perform well when you're small, and it's hard to be big. So it's not surprising, I think, that we're seeing perhaps smaller states largely dominating these top 2 groups of very high and high social progress. Our third group is these upper middle social progress index states. Starting to see some bigger states. Also seeing where we are now, Delhi in this grouping, from Uttarakhand to Manipur. These are the upper middle social progress states. And then we get into some of the big ones into tier 4 under lower middle social progress. So from Haryana, Gujarat, all the way through to Maharashtra, Rajasthan. These big states are very much dominating the sort of tier 4 of lower middle social progress. So this is probably a reasonable average where the bulk of people in India are living. And then our lowest tiers, tier 5, much smaller tiers. Tier 5, this is the low social progress, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha and Madhya Pradesh. And then very low social progress, at the very 6th tier, Assam, Bihar and Jharkhand stand out particularly as being distinctly of the lowest level of social progress. So this is a way we can look at this continuous scale, we'll break it up into different groups according to different states. Now another way we can look at this data is to actually look at how the social progress fits together with economic development. And this is something we've done lots of places in the world, is we've plotted social progress on the vertical axis, and then we've got state GDP on the horizontal axis. And this curve is something we've observed very widely. And essentially what it's telling us is that, yes, economic development is associated with higher levels of social progress. Getting more economic development is a good way of getting social progress as a broad policy goal. And that makes sense. If you have economic growth, you have money to spend on roads and hospitals and schools and all that good stuff that makes social progress. That makes sense. But what we also see is that around this trend line, there's plenty of noise. Essentially, GDP is not destiny. If you're devising the development of your country, your state, your district, based only around maximizing economic development, you may be missing something. There's a missing factor. So if you want inclusive growth, then you've got to be thinking about economic and social development alongside. And we can see very clearly that some states are doing a better job than others at turning their economic resources into social progress. Just to highlight that here, I just thought it'd be interesting to note, our top performing state, Puducherry, is not anywhere near the richest. It's actually very middling level of economic development, but it's doing much better than its GDP peers in terms of social progress. And then just for fun, I thought let's pick out Delhi. I don't want to pick on Delhi. It's actually a trend we see around the world. Capital cities, capital regions tend to have this story. Capital cities, capital regions attract a lot of economic activity that turbocharge the GDP figures, but actually social progress isn't always that much further ahead. It's true of London, it's true of Brussels, it's true of many cities around the world. But it is fascinating that there you have Delhi and Manipur at the same level of social progress with such an extraordinary differential in levels of per capita income. So it really shows us that if our economic figures alone are only telling us part of the story, and that by focusing on social progress, we can get to understand which types of economic development are delivering for people and which ones are not so effective. So that's the state level results. Now, I am not planning to take you through 707 different districts, but actually before I do that, let me just quickly show you a bit more granular data on the states. So for each of the states, we have what we call a social progress scorecard. And don't be scared when you see it. It's a bit daunting when you first see it, especially for people like me who are a bit colorblind. But what we've done for each state is we've said, how do you compare to other states with similar levels of income? So we benchmark each state against 15 peer states of similar levels of gross domestic state product per capita. So it's a bit like boxing. We're saying we're comparing economic heavyweights with economic heavyweights, economic lightweights with economic lightweights. And then we say, are you statistically significantly performing the median of that group or not? And so here we are for Puducherry, perhaps unsurprisingly, at the very top there you see the big green light. So Puducherry, because it's a state that's on pretty modest income, is delivering a high level of social progress. That's overperforming and has a green mark. But when you dig into it, you see that, of course, it's not the case that Puducherry is brilliant on everything. It does have some areas of strength on shelter, on personal freedom and choice, on access to advanced education. But in other areas, it's performing on the average. And very strikingly, in one area, health and wellness, it's actually underperforming. So I always want to emphasize that we don't just want to take the aggregate social progress index score alone. What this tool allows us to do is unpack it and understand the particular nature of each community, each state. And there, I mean, just looking at what's going on in Puducherry under health and wellness, there seems to be a lot to do with diabetes and high blood pressure, which seems to be health issues are rising more from prosperity. So there's been some particular issues that Puducherry may be facing. Contrast that, then let's just look at the Delhi scorecard, and unsurprisingly, most of that is red and amber. A little bit of green. Personal freedom and choice actually is good in Delhi, better than the average. And of course, the group that Delhi is being compared to is a richer group than we were comparing Puducherry to, obviously, because that's the way this tool works. But we see the different areas in which Delhi is underperforming. And finally, just quickly look at Manipur. So Manipur It's doing as well as Delhi, it's a lot poorer, but actually it's not statistically significantly outperforming its peers. It's got an amber light rather than the green light. But again, we do see there are areas where Manipur is showing strength: nutrition and basic medical care, personal safety, access to information, access to basic knowledge, personal freedom and choice, and access to advanced education. So some areas of strength, but also again another state suffering from particular weaknesses around health and wellness. So we have scorecards like this available for each of the 36 states and union territories to give you that diagnostic of what's driving those scores, what's driving those results. Now, let me take us on to have a look at the districts. As Amit said, with the district, with the... Sorry, I'm getting confused by two things. I can't see the screen. Sorry about that. Let me just quickly take you back then, just quickly show, since I was misleading you. So here is the Delhi scorecard I was just talking about. So you see with Delhi, a lot of red. There is a green there for personal freedom and choice, but otherwise broadly red overall, as you'd expect for a state with high income but only modest social progress. And then here is Manipur. And as I was saying, Manipur is on average performing about within the expected range of a state of that income, but it does have some significant areas of strength, but also notably a weakness as well. So those are the scorecards available for all of the states. Now, so for the districts, we've got, as Amit said, 49 indicators. So to get data coverage for 707 districts, we couldn't replicate the 89 indicators from the state level index, but with 49 indicators, that's more than enough to give us a robust measure at district level. So these are the 49 indicators we've used. And as I said, I'm not going to talk you through all 707 districts, but what we find is that there's a number of top performing districts with some actually quite high scores, concentrated largely in states that are already doing quite well. So these are largely coming from states that are doing pretty well. And if we look at the other way, we can look at the states that are the bottom 10 performers. On the whole, these lowest 10 performing districts are coming from states that are performing in the lowest tiers as well. So that's the broad pattern that we see across the sort of best and worst performing districts. We don't have GDP or equivalent data for the districts, so we can't show you the relationship between districts and economic activity. What I thought I might show you, however, is looking at some of the intrastate differences. So here is Maharashtra. And I think what's really fascinating about this state is the fact you've got all 6 tiers within one state. Yeah? So you've got this within one state, this enormous diversity of scores for the different districts. And indeed, I mean, it's, one of the things we talk about with policymakers is that trying to equalize economic activity across a geography is in some sense always going to be an impossible task. Some places will be, because of their physical geography, their human geography, there will always be inequality in economic activity. However, equalizing social progress across the territory is actually a meaningful policy goal, delivering equally for all citizens. So the diversity of scores here is quite striking. And we see this for a number of states. And again, a useful analysis that's in the report is looking at which states are better than others at equalizing levels of social progress across their territories. Now, as I said, we don't have the economic data, so we can't generate scorecards for the districts. But we have a different way of generating scorecards for districts, which is by using how they compare against other districts within their state. So here, for example, is a scorecard for Pune within Maharashtra. And so this scorecard, again, the traffic lights are still there. But in this case, we're saying, how does Pune compare to other districts within the state? Is it statistically significantly better than the median, or on the median, around the median, or worse? And here we find that here's Pune, it's a high-performing district, and therefore it's significantly outperforming other districts within the state. There's another district that we could also look at with a very similar score, Ratnagiri, and that's got a very similar level of social progress, very similar scorecard. I just sort of brought these two up for comparison because we do have some data about district income here, and I think it's fair to say that Ratnagiri's district domestic product per capita is about 65% of Pune's. So with this limited data we have available, we can see even at this level, with district differences, it's not, social progress differences are not just explained by economic differences. No? Economics is not destiny. Some districts are better than others at turning their economic resources into social progress outcomes. So you have 707 district scorecards to enjoy in the report. Lots of detail there to go into and to work through. Obviously, if we're talking about districts, that makes us think about aspirational districts. And this is where this tool itself can very practically apply itself to the aspirational districts. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we find a very small number of aspirational districts within the highest levels of social progress in this report. I mean, perhaps understandably, because they are aspirational. And we were looking to see that the trajectory of these districts over the coming years. And as we were saying, as Amit said in the opening remarks, I think the power of this tool, as it's developed year on year, and we build the time series, will really help to understand not just the static picture of where a state or a district is now, but also the trajectory it's on. And I think will give a lot of power to this analysis. And looking forward, I mean, I think it'll be especially exciting if we look at two states that have got very low levels of social progress, Jharkhand and Bihar. Two states that have got a lot of low social progress districts. Two states that have got a lot of aspirational districts within them. Really seeing how these districts developed over the coming years is going to be a really important and exciting challenge to see how those can develop. Because, you know, what the Social Progress Index can do is it can give you a diagnostic. It can tell you something about where you're at, a consensus around that. I mean, my background, I used to work in the British government, and I know that government is hard. Government is hard because it's about making choices. And making choices is difficult when you have different stakeholders using different languages about what they're trying to achieve. The education lobby will lobby for education, the health lobby will lobby for health, the rights lobby will lobby for rights. How do you pull this all together into a decision-making framework to understand your challenges in a collective way? How do you have that conversation between government, business, and civil society? So we really see that Social Progress Index can offer a way of creating that common language across government, but also between government and civil society. It's also a way of creating conversations between different tiers of government. We did some work, I said, with the European Commission, and we released a report where we greatly offended the governor of the region of Katowice in Poland. Because Katowice was one of the most successful economic regions in Poland, and we said that they had the lowest level of social progress. So I was summoned to meet the governor to explain myself. And we talked through the social progress scorecard for that region. It's a heavy industrial area. It has air, a bit like today's in Delhi. And unsurprisingly, it has a number of health-related and environmental issues. And I walked through this with the governor of Katowice and said, you know, the reason you've scored poorly is not because I don't like you. It's not because I've done my sums wrong. It's because you've got some real challenges you're facing that aren't solved just by economic development. And at the end of the conversation, she said, this is great. This shows me what my next level of development is. I've done the basics. I've created the jobs. I've built the bridges. This tells me what I need to do next. But this is also my advocacy tool to Warsaw and to Brussels to say that I need help too. So this is just a way I think that the Social Progress Index can create that dialogue. What it can also do is unleash the power of benchmarking. And this is something Professor Porter is always very powerful about. He says about how in business, there's such a sophisticated benchmarking industry. If I want to make plastic bottles, I can find out who's the best in the business, how they do it, and how to copy it. we don't really have such strong institutions in public policy. And indeed, there's often talk about that we get prescriptions about development. We have what's known as getting to Denmark problem. People will tell you about what's the best in the world, but they won't necessarily tell you what's the most relevant solution for me. And this is what, again, I think the Social Progress Index can do. By benchmarking states and districts on their social progress performance and looking through states in terms of similar levels of economic development, similar levels of geography or demographics, can actually really help to understand who your peers are, who's performing better than you, and who's got ideas, lessons, policies, programs that can be copied and replicated. And that's a huge power, I think. So this is, where we're looking at this data, it's not just about where there are problems, it's about where are there solutions. Wherever you see a green dot on those scorecards, there's potentially a scalable solution that can be applied elsewhere. And that's what this data can do, the richness of this data can do for practical action as well as for policy insight. I started just talking about how the way the Social Progress Index was developed in the first case. And I just want to come back to this point, is that if this is a beautiful and substantial report with a huge amount of insight in it, a huge amount of data in it, but it does nothing if it stays within that document. It only means something if it's taken out to practical action. And our aspiration is that this is a report that contains a tool that can actually be practically useful to people. So I just want to finish again by saying we really welcome your feedback on the tool itself and also your ideas on how this can be applied towards practical action to deliver for the people of India. Thank you very much.